So I covered an article last time talking about the vaccination process that was going on in Israel and how Israel was one of the fastest countries to spread the vaccine to their people. But it was for a reason. Now, the recent article, the previous video, I'll link it at the top, where they published data that said the vaccine was amazing and that according to their statistics, that it reduced the numbers. Now, I completely went into those numbers. You can watch that video. It's not that long. I'll leave a link of it at the top. Now, this is what goes further. And we're going to cover two different articles in this video. It says, as Israel reopens, whoever does not get vaccinated will be left behind. The new government and business initiatives are moving in the direction of a two-tier system for vaccinated and unvaccinated, raising legal and moral and ethical questions. It says nearly half of Israel's population has received at least one dose of the Pfizer vaccine. And all right, you should keep this is as of February 18th, 2021. And it says, and Israel has raced ahead with the fastest vaccine campaign in the world, inoculating nearly half its population with at least one dose. Now the rapid rollout turning the country into a live laboratory for setting rules in a vaccinated society, raising thorny questions about rights, obligations, and the greater good. The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet voted this week to open shopping malls and museums to the public, subject to social distancing and mandatory masking. And it's like, if you got half the population vaccinated, why does everybody need to still social distance and continue to wear masks? So for the first time in many months, gyms, cultural and sports events, hotels, and swimming pools will also reopen, but only for some. Under a new green badge system that functions as both a carrot and a stick, the government is making leisure activities accessible only to people who have been fully vaccinated or received or recovered starting Sunday. 2 weeks later, restaurants, events, and conference halls will be allowed to operate under those rules. Customers and attendees will have to carry a certificate of vaccination with a QR code. And this will be the future for those who choose not to get vaccinated. And this, I have no doubt that this sort of mentality will find its way in many different countries. And Israel was basically the guinea pig for this event. We're going to go into an article that talks in depthly about that, because it wasn't for no reason that Israel went and vaccinated a small population, vaccinated their population. They have a small population. I believe it's about 9 million. They had a very small, I should say, it had about 715,000 people that tested positive, with only about 5,800 people who had died as a result of the virus. So it represents a very small population of people who were both infected and, of course, individuals who lost their life to the virus. But I went more in depth with with that video up above. Israel is one of the first countries grappling in real time with a host of legal, moral, and ethical questions, and it tries to balance the steps towards resuming public life with sensitive issues such as public safety, discrimination, free choice, and privacy. And it's weird because, when you look back in Jewish people's history, Hitler experimented not just only on the Jews, but on other people. But they made them wear, what was it, the purple star, I believe, back then. So it's so weird that they would, history would repeat itself among their own people, with one using an experimental vaccine, forcing it to an extent on people, as they will later do, because the more people who get vaccinated, either because they feel pressured or individuals just like, I just want to have some semblance of my life back. So it's not that these people want to get vaccinated, it's that some people want to, which is fine. If you want to, go right ahead. For those that believe the science, you're more than welcome to get vaccinated. But then you have other people that have done their research, read the numbers, seen the numbers, read the statistics, and also have seen the fuckery that goes on with the testing and gunshot wounds and gunshot gunshot victims being labeled as C-19.
The names of the people here, but I can tell you a little bit about them. And what I'm going to do is show you, I'm going to flip the camera around and give you a look at the document for yourself. So that's the spreadsheet there, and highlighted in yellow were a few cases that I had questions about and wanted to know more about. So one of the first ones highlighted here in yellow, this person was 90 years old, male. They were COVID positive. They died at Delray Medical Center. But here, under the cause of death, it says complications of a left hip fracture fall. And then under contributing causes of death, it talks about cardiovascular disease, but in neither of these columns does it talk about COVID-19. So that jumped out at me, and scrolling through, I've highlighted a few other ones that I just had questions about. So the cause of death here, blunt head trauma for one of these patients. Others, you'll see heart failure and chronic kidney disease, but again, no mention of COVID-19, even though this person tested positive. So what I thought was going on here is that all of these deaths were COVID positive deaths, and even if their cause of death wasn't COVID-19, they were still being lumped into this count.
And they realize that you're just messing with the numbers, right? You're cooking the books. So why would I take a vaccine for a disease that has a 99% survival rate, and on top of that, I know that you're messing with the numbers to try to pretend to make it seem like it's more deadly than it really is? And this is, of course, all part of a much larger narrative that, as a result of people not taking a stand, and this is straight from the Bible. I did a video on this talking about 1 Samuel's, I believe it's 1 Samuel's chapter 2, talking about the outcome when people give over their right to freedom, and as a result want to be led by men. This is what you get. It says, getting vaccinated is a moral duty. It is part of our mutual responsibility. And of course, this is the propaganda that gets spun, said the health minister, Yuli Edelstein. He also has a new mantra: whoever does not get vaccinated will be left behind. The debate swirling within Israel's percolating across other parts of the world as well, with plans to reserve international travel for vaccinated green passport holders, and a warning: growing disparities between more vaccinated affluent countries and less vaccinated poor ones. And this is also true. A lot of the more wealthier countries are basically buying up all the vaccines. It's not that many of these poorer countries have high numbers. Overwhelmingly, it's usually Western countries that are dealing primarily with the virus. You really don't see it in a lot of smaller countries. But what the larger countries will do, and this is all about, it amazes me that the left overwhelmingly talk about things are not fair and equality. But then you see these very same governments that are represented by the left, like, for example, America. America is heavily left-centered in terms of its population, and in terms of the people that represent them. That's what they say, that the people who are in positions of authority are merely representations of the people. That's all they are. So if you wonder why this type of person is being elected, is because overwhelmingly that is the mentality of the people. Just like people say, well, why do I keep meeting this particular type of person? Is because that's who you are, even though you might not want to admit it, because people attract like-minded individuals. Is Israel's central government eager to bring the country out of its national lockdown without setting, and there's no reason for them to have a lockdown. They've only had 5,800 deaths in a population of 8 million, with a C-19 infection number of 715, with like 90, it's like almost 91% of those who had it recovered. So, and then it's of the people who died out of the population who got tested and were considered infected, it was only 0.7%. There's no reason to have a lockdown unless you have a different narrative for the lockdown that has nothing to do with the virus. And that's the point. The point is to lock people down, impoverish people, make them dependent upon the state, and then force them to get vaccinated. This is without setting a new wave of infections. This was spurred in action by local initiatives, chafing under the country's lockdown regulations. An indoor shopping mall in the working class of Tel Aviv suburb at Batiem through its indoor open last week for customers who could provoke what they could prove that they had been vaccinated or had recovered from C-19. It goes on to state his office began processing requests for employers who could verify that all their employees had received the requisite two vaccine doses or had recovered from the virus. Right. So this will also pose a problem moving forward with who will get jobs. So if you don't want to be vaccinated, then employers moving forward, because I have no doubt that the government will be like, well, if you don't do this, then we're not going to give you like any sort of funding, or we'll fine you, etc. And then you'll have, the people on the left that will be like, oh, I'm going to get sick even though you took a vaccine. But this will be the narrative. And of course, as more countries follow Israel's lead, this will be to the detriment of humanity. And of course, this is all doctored information, right? A lot of their vaccine information is very doctored. And we'll just cut real quick to the other article, right? It says vaccines for data. Israel's Pfizer deal drives quick rollout, privacy worries. Now, this came out of January 31st, 2021. And so basically the gist of this article, I will link both of these articles below, was that Israel started buying from Pfizer. Then Israel basically made a deal and said to Pfizer, and they were like, hey, you give us those vaccines for free and we'll give you some data. How's that work out for you, right? We'll roll out some real quick data for you, huh? That sound good? We'll get you some good data, right? That's basically what happens. Why Israel was like gung-ho about literally jabbing everybody in the arm with the Pfizer vaccine was because it was given to them. It was given to them for the most part for free, and as a result, Pfizer got this amazing data that proved 96% of the time that the vaccine was working in the arms of the people. And so you can read more in depthly about that here. As it goes on to say, and then basically the gist of this article says they may involve some damage to individuals' rights, but not all damage is prohibited if it is well balanced and legitimate in order to achieve a worthy goal. So this is basically the propaganda, the wording that we understand that some people have to give up some of their rights, but it's for a worthy goal. It's your choice. It's your choice, but if you choose to go in that direction, there are going to be all these restrictions about where you'll be able to work, where you'll be able to move in terms of, like whether you'll be able to do indoor dining or outdoor dining, etc. Right? Because and of course, as more people get vaccinated, they'll just tighten the grip on what sort of things that they will, of course, allow you to do. It's your choice, she added, as a leisure activities. If you're vaccinated, you can enter. As long as you aren't, we can't let you endanger others. You see that? And so that's the mindset that they will create in other individuals. It's very dangerous moving forward. It's very dangerous moving forward to view your common citizen that way. That if you don't get vaccinated, well, then you're a danger to society, right? And so this sort of mentality that easily allows for individuals to be rolled into FEMA camps, or the new form of concentration camps, kind of like what you see going on in China, very similar to what Governor Cuomo basically put on the books, that they want to introduce FEMA camps. And of course, this doesn't have to roll out immediately, because if you do all this at once, right? If you do all of these things at once, right, you're like, if you don't get the vaccine, then you can't go here, or we're going to throw you in a camp. The people would just be like, fuck this, and they're going to lose their minds and they're going to revolt. But what they do is they add it very slowly, right? Over time, they see how the people react. They see the anger. They let the water boil to a point, and then they let it simmer, and then they let it boil to a point, and they let it simmer. Let it boil to a point, and let it simmer. And that's because people will eventually become used to, because they hear about it constantly. They hear about individuals having to get vaccinated. They hear about this over and over and over again, and so people start to crack. under the pressure, and of course the desire to go back to life as they once had. And the reason being I bring this up is because isolation, or the feeling of isolation, is detrimental to us as humans. We are designed by nature to want to interact with one another. And so, and that's one of the reasons why in the very beginning, you had many governments, especially here in America, where they were even telling you not to interact or touch or hug, your grandparents, for fear of getting them sick.
Eric, you can put them down here. Since you're a little shorter. It's a hug.
Oh, that's
No,
the hug.
Put
your throat.
Oh, I shouldn't say.
And so that limits, interaction, fellowship between family members, especially between older, more wiser individuals that you can then talk to and get information from, and draw encouragement from. And that's the purpose of us being able to interact with one another. As the Bible says, iron sharpens iron. So one man's face sharpens the other. And that's the whole point, is that they don't want that. They don't want that interaction. That where people start to draw strength from one another, they want to break that down. The Bible book of Proverbs says that one isolating himself just basically thinks of his own selfishness against all practical wisdom he breaks forth. Meaning that people who have a tendency to isolate themselves, they're just going to solely think about themselves. Even if you give them sound advice, they'll just push on forward. And that's the danger of isolating people, isolating individuals, and isolating groups, is that individuals start to become self-centered. And that's exactly what the government wants. It's very important to understand that even though many of these principles are understood by those in positions of power, they may disregard the God of the Bible, or which is what you see now with the left trying to disregard the whole male versus female. As the Bible says, God made them male and female. And so this is just merely an attack on religion and religious beliefs, especially those centered around the Bible, or the Torah, or even within like Muslim groups, right? Because these individuals heavily lean their moral inclinations typically from the God, almost similarly the God of the Bible. Basically the exact same thing. So moving forward, it becomes a danger to those who do believe in such things, because eventually the government, of course, will turn against you. We're already seeing it with cancel culture. But even more importantly, in terms of what you put in your body when it comes to an experimental vaccine, I have no doubt moving forward that for many people will lose their lives just as a result of the virus. And years from now, they will discover side effects that, of course, that either were known and they just didn't disclose, which is why I did a video talking about where Miami University, talking to men, saying that if you're a man and you were going to take the vaccine, they recommended that you save your sperm. The reason being is because they're not sure if infertility or sterility would be a side effect. And that's the point. That's the point, is that you never know what the agenda is moving forward in regards to what this vaccine is for. The propaganda being pushed is that it will save you or lessen the effects of this virus. But if you actually just look at the statistics, which they don't like to go over, is that the virus has a survival rate of 99+%. For anybody under the age of 70, 99, it's like 99.3 or 99.6, depending upon the country, that overwhelmingly most of these individuals survive. Overwhelmingly, most of the people who do lose their life are typically those who are beyond life expectancy. And I can tell you from my experience, many of these individuals really don't get great care. Most of them just end up just getting some sort of broad spectrum antibiotic. They get remdesivir, which doesn't do shit. I've done an article talking about that already, but they still give it to them, even though it's been months. It's been like 7-8 months where it's been proven, even through the World Health Organization, that remdesivir doesn't do nothing, just snake oil that they give, but it's very expensive, and it's thrown on the backs of the taxpayer because it's all covered under, at least in America, it's covered under the CARE Act, right? but it doesn't do anything. And then of course they just give you either oxygen or high flow oxygen, and eventually you make your way onto a vent and then you die. And that's basically been like 90% of all the cases that we've had where they end up in the ICU, they all die. And that's mostly what happens. Once that patient requires a vent, for the most part, they don't do well. There's also no rehabilitation going for many of these individuals. Overwhelmingly, for people who have any sort of respiratory disease, they should not remain in the bed because it minimizes your ability to expand your lungs. And then, of course, it causes pneumonia. Many of these patients, they don't even, especially if they're like a little bit older, they just leave them in the bed 24 hours a day. And I speak to many of my patients and I'll try to get them up, either ambulate them to the bathroom, put them on a commode, sit them in a chair for a little while. And what you see is many of these individuals, they start to spontaneously cough. And that's because they have fluid at the bottom of their lungs. This fluid is what leads to pneumonia. And of course, later on, it's what leads to poor perfusion, because you basically gunk up the alveoli, and that many of these patients, they can breathe, but they're tachypnic, they breathe very fast, but they're not perfusing, right? So their body is not getting enough oxygen, so their O2 stat starts to drop, and eventually they get intubated, and then eventually they die. It's because the process is not being interrupted. That's the problem, is the process of what's happening for the patient is not being interrupted. Simple things like getting people out of bed, doing chest PT from nurses, even postural drainage, so that whatever is in the lungs can basically flow out. These are all important steps to utilize when taking care of any patient with a respiratory disease, but especially those with C19. Many of these individuals become very anxious as a result of becoming short of breath, and then of course it's basically a circle. The person gets a little short of breath, they become anxious, they get more short of breath, etc. And of course, and from my experience and the experience of many of my fellow colleagues, is that they don't medicate the patients when it comes to anxiety, because it when overdosed, it can interfere with a person's respiratory drive, which is true, but so does the anxiety. So does the anxiety in many of these patients. The other thing is that sometimes you don't get a nurse that necessarily cares about the outcome, which is just a fact. Not everybody who became a nurse because they care about people. Some people just do it for the money. It's just a job. It's a high-paying job. Overwhelmingly, it's an overpaid job, especially when you compare more dangerous jobs where men put their life at risk. For the most part, nurses give medications between like 9 and 11 or 8 and 11. They sit down from they go on break. Typically, especially if you work at night, you get like an hour and a half, 2-hour break. So out of the 12 hours that you work, you're technically working maybe 4 or 5 of those hours. And for the most part, you're sitting down basically at the nurse's station, just watching your patients or watching O2 stat, watching heart rates, etc. It's not that difficult of a job. But from my experience, is that you can intervene more for your patients, especially with what I just stated before, getting patients out of bed. And sometimes I become surprised at how individuals, complain. There's patients calling all the time. Most of these patients they're restricted to their rooms. They're not allowed to leave. And on top of that, here, their family members are not allowed to see them. So you can't, again, same principle, right? Those who are isolated will only seek their own selfish means. And so unfortunately, because many of these individuals cannot draw strength from their families, they have to hope to draw strength from their loved ones. It's not the same talking to somebody over the phone. It's not. Holding somebody's hand, giving them a hug, telling the person that you love them, especially from those that you've grown up with or your family members. It makes a world of difference in terms of your headspace and how you will basically recover. For many individuals, if they feel that they have no hope, eventually their body will just give out. I've seen it numerous times with many of these patients where they just give up. They tell me constantly that I'm there, that they're alone. They'll hold on to your hand. They'll ask you not to leave. And unfortunately, because we're short, when you're short staffed, you have to move from patient to patient to make sure that everybody gets adequate care. And it's very unfortunate. I disagree with the model that they utilize, where they isolate many of these individuals who are sick, when the statistics show that overwhelmingly young people do not experience the virus in any way, shape, or form to the extent that geriatric patients do. There's no reason to inhibit individuals from of course, seeing their loved ones. But it's like Jesus said, those peoples who do works don't want their works to come to the light. Right? He says, all those who are righteous they're not afraid of the light, but those who do are, right? Those who do not want to head towards the light, the reason being is that they don't want to be exposed, as the Bible says, because their works are wicked. And that is the unfortunate outcome for many of these patients, and why many of them unfortunately lose their lives. It's very sad that this is the time period that, for us living in it, if people don't do anything and they just go along with the motions, many will die. Many will die. Unfortunate outcome. Racism and the separation of people will be even more. It is the goal and the role of the government to separate people. Otherwise, you wouldn't need them if you were able to self-govern, which is what the book of Samuel talks about. The downfall of humanity as a result of choosing not to be governed by God, as already outlined in the scriptures thousands of years ago, and instead opting to be ruled by men. And as a result of that, they suffer.